We spent millions of years at constant war, and then 50 years ago,
So what does it
suddenly
do?
we had peace.
What does it do?
Yes.
So first of all, what you notice is that our evolutionary instincts don't hit in. So our instincts are induced at times of stress, and particularly mortality salience. And the more there's variation within the population with regard to how environmentally sensitive people are, and how much it's just hardwired.
So what is environmentally sensitive?
Well, so to what extent? So like, let's say, for example, sexuality. So the genetic component to male sexuality is 40% on average. On average. So there's going to be some people that are highly genetically straight. Yeah.
Okay.
And some people that are going to be rather less so. And so if they're put on put on the optimum environment, then that could do things to their sexuality. They could be knocked off the canalization.
Oh, if they happen to be born in Afghanistan, for
or
example.
whatever.
Yes.
But for example,
or Brighton,
you get people, let's say at a boys' public school, that go through a phase of being gay, and then they're not gay. I mean, they grow up, they're not gay. They go to university or whatever, or sixth form, college, and they're surrounded by girls, and suddenly that gay phase is well in the past, right? Yes. And they're probably quite happy they never acted upon it. But that's what I mean. Those people are more environmentally sensitive. So we were talking earlier on the live stream about Enoch Powell. So Enoch Powell goes to Cambridge in the early 30s. It's all male. He has nothing to do with the few women that are there training to be teachers or whatever. He then goes to the University of Sydney to be a professor, and that's basically all male at the time, probably, or pretty much so. Right. And he comes to the conclusion that he's gay. And he writes to his parents and he says, "I'm gay." And they're very, 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 very accepting of this. He's their only son. And then eventually, of course, he realizes he's not gay. But he's environmentally sensitive. There's some evidence that highly intelligent people, the more intelligent you are, the more environmentally sensitive you are. Because intelligence is about solving problems.
So if I ever find myself in jail, I should be wary of the smart people?
Yeah, possibly. But certainly, intelligence is about solving problems. How do you solve problems? Part of it is that you rise above instinctive responses. So it would make sense, like that coin flipping thing that most of our members of parliament got wrong, the probability things, infamously. So it makes sense that people that are intelligent are more environmentally sensitive. So it then further makes sense, if you take us out of our evolutionary match, then it's going to be the intelligent who are more likely to find that their instincts aren't brought out. And it's going to be the intelligent that are more likely to not just not have children, but to literally not want children. And this is what the data is showing us, that intelligent people are literally less likely to want children because they're more environmentally sensitive. And the same thing happens at the height of Rome and the height of Greece. It's noticed that the higher classes, i.e. the more intelligent, simply don't want children.
Well, this is the opening scene of Idiocracy, isn't it? Where, I don't know if you've seen that film, but basically the intelligent people are fretting about what's going on in the news.
Yeah, the way they portray it there is that these people, they'd like to have children, but they're constantly putting it off because they want a certain standard of living for their child and that sort of thing. And they want to be able to invest in it to a certain degree. I think that's more what you would call K strategy, i.e. that you are a born nurturer and you want to be able to nurture your child so it competes the best. Although that does correlate weakly with being intelligent. But intelligence on its own, what they're showing is they want to have children, and eventually she leaves it too late, right? But they just literally wouldn't want to have them at all. Which is a slightly different thing from what's shown in Idiocracy. And this, of course, considering the high heritability of intelligence, of it's about 80% genetic, helps to explain why in advanced civilizations, intelligence starts to go down. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be any innovations at an advanced level of civilization. I mean, we innovated stained glass during the collapse of the Roman Empire, during the collapse of it. We're innovating AI and so forth now, during what's basically a kind of slow motion collapse. But in general, intelligence goes down. The point is that mortality salience induces these instincts. It induces an instinct to have children. We know that there's studies on this. And it induces religiosity as a coping mechanism. And then religiosity makes you feel that life has eternal meaning. You really feel it. And you're therefore happier, and you're more content, and you're less depressed, and therefore you're more likely to have children. But you're in your evolutionary match, and war, to a very extreme degree, puts you in that match. Those things that make you depressed, those things that you sometimes, at your darker moments, you might have this little voice in your head saying, "Dan, old chap, what's the bloody point? I mean, what's the point, really?" Maybe sometimes
Don't really get
your
that, but
darker moments,
yeah.
or just a general sense of worrying about the future sometimes, or whatever. In a situation of warfare, that's not there. You're just living in the now. You're living in the now, in the present, struggling to survive. You haven't really got time to
Yes, I
ruminate.
suppose, irrespective of how smart you are, if you're in the trench with bombs going off beside you, you're rather focused
You
on.
just get on with it.
Yes.
You just get on with it. And so, okay, there are going to be some people who are of the temperament that even in those circumstances they will ruminate and whatever. The war poets, or Siegfried
Yes.
Sassoon,
But that was probably the quieter moments.
Wilfred
rather
Owen.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And those were probably a particularly
Because there is this effect where after a war, people have a lot more. It makes them frisky.
yeah,
And there's a baby boom. So obviously there was the massive. We literally got a generation called the baby boomers, who were the boom of the generation after the war. Is that common? I mean, after the First
It's
World War?
exactly the same thing after the First World War. So
if we look at Vietnam now, we should see the Gen X generation be the baby boom, should we? Presumably.
well, Vietnam, possibly. I haven't looked into the data, but
Right.
in
But generally, wherever there's a war, you
generally,
expect
where
to
there's
see
a
a baby
war,
boom follow.
you would expect a baby boom to follow it, because people have been exposed to mortality salience. And this is important, I think, if we think about the way in which Britain has sort of become decadent over the last 30 or 40 years. It probably was beginning to become decadent. In fact, they talked about this in the 1890s. In the 1890s, okay, we still had maybe 10% child mortality then, so people are surrounded by death to a greater extent. So it does induce mortality salience, it does induce religiosity, it does induce a desire to have children. 10% child mortality, which is what child mortality is in, I don't know, somewhere like Afghanistan or somewhere, or parts of India today. But you hadn't had a war for a very long time. There hadn't been a serious war that really affected the possibility of the country being invaded by the late Victorian era for
Yes.
at least 50 years. And so and there was this talk of it being decadent and so forth. And then you had the First World War. And then you have a generation running the country that's been through a war. And this is going to make them essentially high mortality salience, probably more conservative, more religious, more based in certain ways. That's what you would expect it to do. And then you have a gap, really. And then you have another generation, my grandparents' generation, that were in charge when we were growing up, the Geoffrey Howes of this world and the Willie Whitelaws of this world. And they've all fought in wars. And so this is probably going to act as a stop, as a preventative, for decadence and for being in an evolutionary mismatch, because you've got this generation that's alive telling you about all these awful things that happen, and how fragile what you've got is, and how it has to be fought for, and all this. And
Yes.
then those people have now gone, and you've had a generation that has been brought up by people born in the 40s who never actually experienced the violence. Maybe they experienced the aftermath, maybe their dads were killed in the war in some cases, but never actually experienced this for themselves.
Yes, because of course this country kind of really went off the rails in the early 2000s.
Late 90s, you have a generation
Yes.
that comes in, and a lot of them born in the 50s.
Yes, and the late 90s, the early 2000s is about the period where we were losing a significant amount of the wartime generation, to the point now where there were still a few people who were alive and served during the war, but they're very few and far between now. Generally, the oldest people you meet might have been
Children.
evacuees, children during the war.
Exactly. And they're certainly not in positions of power, and that's important. They're not running it, Dan. They're not running the show. Whereas in the 80s, they were running the show, and certainly in the 70s. So I think that's a significant shift, and it helps to explain why it's a compounding factor on top of all kinds of other things. Childhood narcissism, bringing up children where you say they can be whatever they like, mollycoddling, not having a sense of how fragile things can be. And that's what decadence is, really. And I think that's part of the fact that we're so far from what is our match, which is a serious, frightening struggle, which is a war. And I would suspect that part of the reason why Northern Ireland is so far behind us in collapsing into insanity, if you go there, is because A, it's probably genetic anyway, but B, part of it may well be that they have been through the troubles.
So just make me understand evolutionary match. I mean, we're not saying that it's desirable to have a war. What we're saying is that we have evolved as a species to be at war, and then when we're not in the same set of conditions as we evolved in, that is a lack of evolutionary match.
Right, that's a lack of evolutionary match, and what that can do is basically, and you see this with some animals that kept in captivity, it just sends them mad. And we are a particularly environmentally sensitive species. We are K strategists. You have the R strategy, that you're evolved to live fast and die young in an unstable but easy ecology. And you have the K strategy, the other extreme of the spectrum, where you are in a stable but extreme.
Humans can do both, can they?
The humans compared to other species are highly K strategic. That's why we have 2 nipples rather than 6. I mean, we have a small number of offspring, and we invest in them, we nurture them in order to compete against the world and against
But I would say people of the Western civilization, you might expect to have 2, maybe 3 children, often 1, whereas there are other cultures where
within humanity there are differences in this RK spectrum. Sure, absolutely. I mean, I did a whole book on this years ago called J. Philippe Rush and a Life History Perspective. But yeah, there is, of course, there's difference within groups. There'd be difference within English people. There'd be difference, individual differences in it. But do you have lots of kids by lots of people? Are you sexually promiscuous? That's more an R thing. Unstable ecology, pass the genes as quickly as you can. Or do you have a small number of offspring by a small number of partners and invest a great deal of energy in them in order to ensure that they competitively survive? Now, if you do that, then you are evolved often to a very specific niche. And so therefore you have to be extremely environmentally sensitive, extremely flexible to survive this constant competition. You can't just this is my niche and I will, this is my situation and this is what I'll do. That's what generalists do. That's why certain species, I don't know, hoverflies or whatever, can survive all over the place. You're adapted to a very specific niche, and so it helps to be flexible, so that you can compete better and survive. So therefore, you become very, very environmentally sensitive, and we humans are very, very environmentally sensitive. So being in an evolutionary mismatch is a particular problem for us.
Is there a way that you can measure environmental sensitivity and apply a score to different species?
I suppose things. Environmental sensitivity, well, it would be the flexibility of thinking. Intelligence, basically, seems to be associated with environmental sensitivity.
Oh, okay. So humans are going to be at the top end of that.
Humans are very high on this. I mean, there's variation in that. I mean, pandas, for example, seem to be very environmentally sensitive. And if you don't put them in the exact environment, they don't breed. Now, that's a bit of a strange outlier, because I don't know otherwise how K-strategic they are, but they seem to be they're a bit of a problem, pandas, for that. They've got to be the exact environment, it's got to be exactly right, or they don't breed. But humans are very environmentally sensitive, so this is part of what makes us unhappy. We thought we were unhappy when we left Eden, because we were self-aware, and therefore we could dwell on these problems of being aware of death and whatever, which is perhaps the key problem for us, that we are aware of death. But ironically, we're in a situation now, I think, where even though death has retreated from our lives, it used to be that everybody, if you go back to our great-grandparents' generation, had lost a sibling as a child.
Oh, it's common, yes.
Very common, or whatever. So we are more frightened of death probably than we ever have been.
And it's more absent.
Even though it's the most absent as it's ever been in our history.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.